So the topic today is why Christianity is necessary for society.
There's Elijah.
So what I mean by necessary for society. So in order for society to sustain itself, it must not only be self-sustaining, but also must progress. So what sociologists define a self-sustaining society would be things like the 2.1 birth rate for like replacement level, and also must progress technologically and morally. And my argument is that Christianity, like specifically Christian doctrine, is the only worldview that can account for all the variables needed for a society as described like this. So here's an overview. So I'm going to briefly explain the benefits of Christianity, how it has developed society morally and scientifically. And then I'm going to explain why Christianity is necessary. And I'm going to contrast it with different worldviews, specifically secularism and Islam. But then lastly, I'm going to address two potential counter-arguments. So first off, I'm going to go over slavery in the ancient world. So the first ever person to call for the abolition of slavery was Gregory of Nyssa. And Adam Couchman actually has a whole book dedicated to this. And so he goes over Gregory's fourth homily about how slavery is not compatible with the Christian worldview because it violates the imago Dei. So you can't violate someone else because they're made in the image of God. And so this was very radical at the time because slavery was very embedded in society. So Kyle Harper, in his book Slavery in the Late Roman World, says that the world was inconceivable without slavery. Slavery was implicated in every aspect of social life. So we don't really have a good comparison because nothing was as radical today as saying slavery shouldn't be done back then. And an example of this is during the Zayden rebellion in 869, Ali ibn Muhammad, one of the main leaders of the revolt, promised the slaves at that time that whenever they took over their masters, they would enslave their masters and have slaves of their own. So the main goal wasn't to end slavery, it was to become slave masters. And Aristotle, who was very influential at the time, said that some people were born to be slaves. And then in the Middle Ages, so priests began to tell masters to free their slaves so that they would gain salvation. And Christian bishops would buy slaves in massive numbers just to release them. And then before 1500, every country in Europe had outlawed slavery or had restricted it. In 1477, Isabella of Spain outlawed slavery in newly conquered territories and demanded that the natives be treated as Spanish citizens unless they're hostile or cannibals. And then lastly, in America. So during the early days of America, during the Atlantic slave trade, slave masters would prohibit slaves from learning about Christianity because that would cause them to be free. Because at that time, there was laws that said that you can't enslave Christians. So if you have a slave and they learn about Christianity, well, you can have them. And so this upset the Spanish church because they believed that every human had the right to be in communion with God and receive God's sacraments. And as the amount of African Christians grew, slave owners began to redefine Christian in terms of like being white or certain attributes to discredit African Christians for the purpose of owning slaves. And liberation theology was this idea from African Christians that every that everyone deserves the right to be liberated from slavery. And so it became more and more difficult to hold both ideas of Christianity and slavery. And then this is a continuation. So Robert Fogel describes the abolition movement as a crusade in several senses. It was a militant and uncompromising war against slavery. It was a holy war inspired by deep religious convictions of its leaders. And so this is from Rodney Stark's book, Churching of America. And so what this kind of shows is that in the early days of America, where slavery was more open and not as prohibited as it was, the rates of religious adherence were relatively low, but as it grew, so did the abolitionist movement. And the Quaker movement condemned slavery and outcasted any member who wasn't against slavery in 1758. And then this is how Christianity developed the morality that against infanticide. So in the ancient world, particularly in ancient Greece and the Roman world, children were not seen as morally valuable. If they didn't have the interest of the nation or their family, the fathers had the right to kill their children at any time. And because of this mentality, infanticide and abortion were common. And then Plutarch said that children still connected to the umbilical cords were like plants and actual human beings, indicating that the ancient world viewed children as parasites until they grew and were able to honor their family and nation. And then children with disabilities were seen as unable to serve the nation and society. So it was very common to just kill them. And it was also seen as socially unacceptable to mourn the deaths of disabled children. And then early Christians rejected this view of infants and instead recognized their inherent worth. Saint Cyprian of Carthage recognized that infants are made in the image of God and have a human nature, therefore they don't lack any of the attributes that make humans have dignity.
What year was that?
Saint Cyprian, he lived in the late 200s,
Okay.
if I remember correctly. And so this way of thinking persisted throughout history. And then when the Spanish conquistadors invaded the Aztec tribes, they saw the rampant child sacrifice, and then they were disgusted by it, so they destroyed their altars. And so this is where our idea of inherent dignity in humans comes from, because it came from the Christian doctrine. And then this is how science came about through Christian doctrine. So the idea of monotheism, specifically how Gregory of Nyssa talks about this in his On Not Three Gods, that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit all share the same energy or operations. And so this way of thinking gave rise to the idea that we can make an experiment and replicate that, and then we'll get the same results, because there's not like gods, like multiple gods acting upon the forces of nature and then causing chaos. Or in Islam, it says that Allah is the best of deceivers. And so their way of thinking, as I'll show later, of science was that it's very foreign, because only Allah can truly control everything, and we don't really have control over science. So the Christian doctrine of a monotheistic God that doesn't deceive his own people was a very prominent doctrine that contrasted with earlier accounts. And then let's not, yeah.
If I could add to that, just real quick, there's a Muslim clerical movement towards the end of the Islamic Golden Age that killed scientific progress in the Islamic world. It was the clergy of Islam that specifically intentionally stamped out their scientific progress.
Yeah. And so the scientific method itself comes from the idea of the fall, that humans are inherently wounded and imperfect, so we need to make sure that our own biases don't get into our interpretations of the experiments. And so what scientists did is they would consult with several other scientists, and then they would conduct a methodology that's rigorous enough to ensure that the results are accurate. And so, and then lastly, in the history of Christianity, there's a lot of theological disputes. And what this necessitated was that the church fathers would have to rely on a lot of philosophical terms. And so they went back to philosophers like Aristotle in order to use language to more articulate their ideas. And so they were able to read, or they had to also read, a lot of the Greek ideas regarding science. And so they ended up just studying that a lot, which also helped contribute to science. And then the next section is why Christianity specifically is necessary. So philosophers in history have kind of recognized that religion was a stepping stool, but they argued that religion was not necessary. So Karl Marx famously said that religion is the opium of the people. And so he recognized that it was necessary to help society cope, but in a communist utopia, the Portuguese class would be eradicated and religion wouldn't be needed. And it had to be removed because it's the coping of the people. Then so Nietzsche also believed that Christianity gave rise to morals. And he envisioned that the death of God was bad, but it's also good in a way where it gives rise to the Übermensch, the idea that someone can just create their own morals. And so what I want to explore is why this idea is incorrect, and why, in order for us to maintain our moral values, values regarding science and other things, Christianity is needed. So I want to start off with the concept of a sense of the divine. So in the psychology of religion, specifically with the works of Justin Barnett, he has published a book called Born Believers, and it's like decades worth of research in cross-cultural, and he came to the conclusion that humans have an innate sense to worship a god, and that this explains kind of a lot of like why kids will believe in like their parents being like superheroes, because they have like this concept of some sort of idea to believe in a higher power. And then so to explore this a bit further, so Andrew Lang, he was kind of a prominent anthropologist. He was kind of born like around 100 years ago, and he theorized that with older and older societies, as the cultural influence got lower, they're more likely to be monotheistic instead of polytheistic. And so this was like a radical idea at the time, because the view was that it went from like polytheism to monotheism, but he studied like very ancient societies. Like there's this one tribe in Australia that's like 20,000 years old, and so he kind of took that information and then said that it's the opposite. And so what this kind of shows is that we have like a biological innate sense to believe in like a monotheistic God, kind of like in classical theism, where he's all powerful, all loving, etc. And so this is important because secularism tries to suppress this, but as we know from like psychoanalytic theory and other things, like when you suppress your emotions, they don't really disappear, they just manifest in different ways. But then, so what occurs when this sense is suppressed? And so, like with the New Age atheism or the New Atheism movement, they try to remove like this religiosity and a worship of God. But from what research has shown is that it hasn't actually removed it, it's just moved it into other areas. And so with Volkard Creech and Marwan Steinich, I'm probably butchering their names. And so in their dynamics in the history of religions, they state that modern secularization does not make people overall less religious. Rather, the worship of a god has been shifted to worship in spheres of politics, radical nationalism, worship of movements and ideologies, science, scientists being deemed untouchable, questioning glory in certain scientific theories, and scientism, and economics, specifically consumerism. And so what they say is that the largest and most global secular religion is the worship of the individual and like human rights. Then so what does this entail? So when religion becomes privatized and even rejected, worship does not disappear. Instead, worship manifests itself in various ways into idolization. A secular society doesn't have to only idolize one field, and I would argue that in our society specifically, we see worship or idolization of all of those things kind of mixed together. And then so I would argue that in order for secular societies to function, they would have to manifest one of those idolizations into a way that creates a self-sustaining and progressive society, but as I would argue, they can't.
So the idea then is if somebody rejects sort of Christian principles, they most of the time are not moving into a completely non-religious view. They're just shifting their religious views toward fame or money or political power or something of along those lines. But that's not sustainable? Is that essentially what you're
You're
saying? Okay.
Like whenever society rejects like a god, it doesn't become like less religious or it doesn't stop worshiping something. So because we have an inherent sense of the divine, so it doesn't it doesn't suppress itself. It manifests itself into like what their research says, like politics, science, and consumerism.
Or New Age.
Yeah. And so I want to first start with politics. But then, so whenever whenever society starts to secularize, we have witnessed kind of like a more of a worship and idolization of politics. So, and this has caused like increasing political polarization and like the idea that morality is tied to a specific political ideology. And so whenever something political shows up, there's people on all sides, like they have to use that to fit their ideology in order to show that they're actually the ones fighting for morality and progress. And what this causes is that people who disagree with them are seen as evildoers or like enemies of progress. And so what research has also shown is that in more atheist in more secular societies that authoritarianism rises. And so Europe is an interesting one because they're starting to secularize, but we see higher authoritarianism. So like with the UK, for example, they have had a lot of ban on free speech, and lately they're trying to ban a lot of social media sites, and they actually published a propaganda game where basically you're this character and you have to make certain choices, and if you make a choice that's deemed as far right, which is basically just saying, hey, these Muslims, they don't share our same values, maybe we shouldn't be taking all of them in. And so if you stray off, you're put into a re-education camp or school, and they're trying to like bring this idea that you can't have these ideas, that they're wrong essentially. And so with Australia, I think they just passed a bill yesterday, which it was due to the shooting that they had, and so instead of like making actual changes, they actually banned Islamophobia, and it's like up to 5 years. So like, if I made the statement, Afghans are terrorizing Australians with their Islamic values, that statement alone could get me sent to 5 years in jail. So we're seeing a rise of authoritarianism as the West starts to secularize. But then so science. So with the early 20th century, there was this movement of scientism with like this belief that the only way to gain knowledge was through empirical investigation or like a tautology, which is just like something is true because it's identical to itself. And this idea, from my own experience, is still prominent in society. So like a lot of people will like reject like just reasoning or philosophy because it's not deemed as like a science. They want like a peer-reviewed study handed right to them, so they'll reject it. And then, so in 1998, a paper published by Bruce Ryan and other scientists found out that sexual abuse doesn't have like as bad of effects as it was previously thought, and they studied like 58 different studies, and they concluded from that. And then so the U.S. Congress at the time, the Senate and the House both unanimously condemned that study, and then the American Psychological Association actually made a statement saying that, scientists, whenever they conduct their research, they have to consider public policy before publishing their research. And so this creates like a problem because it suppresses, actual science if it doesn't go with an agenda or societal expectation. So this contrasts with the way that Christians have historically viewed science. So, for instance, in 1615, whenever Galileo was being questioned for heliocentrism, Bellarmine wrote to Galileo and some other church leaders and said, even if Galileo is correct, and their main critique of him was just that he wasn't bringing any evidence. And so they said that even if we were incorrect, the only thing that we would have to change is our interpretation of Scripture. And then, so I have a few studies here. So this study is published by a lot of scientists. And so in their paper, they argue against campaigns that are against female genital mutilation.
They argue, so just to be clear, they argue against anti-FGM campaigns.
Yeah, so they're pro female genital mutilation. And so their argument is that it's harmful because it's Islamophobic and racist, pretty much. So they appeal to cultural relativism and say that anti-FGM comes from colonialism, therefore it's bad. Like that's pretty much their entire argument. And then, so for this one, this paper argues that being white is a parasitic-like condition that targets and affects non-white people. They says it's nearly impossible to eliminate and calls for a permanent cure, whatever that means.
A final solution?
And then so this was published in the official American Psychoanalytic Theory, which is kind of like a major journal. I checked, and it's not redacted or anything. And then so for here, this is the Grievance Studies Affair, which was conducted in late 2018, early 2019. And so they published 20 papers, or wrote 20 papers, and only 9 of them were rejected. And so they completely fabricated this, and so what their papers range from feminist astrology, to how certain restaurants perpetuate a patriarchal environment. So what this is meant to show you is that science has moved away from this idea of seeking truth. It's become more dogmatic. The scientist who discovered the gene, he actually got his Nobel Prize taken from him because he said that there's a correlation between IQ and race. And so you can disagree with that, but the point is that whenever science starts to become dogmatic, it's viewed as and it's supposed to be viewed as a source of truth. It becomes sort of a power to this power structure where people can push ideas into the academic environment, and then their ideas will be pushed back to the public.
So, obviously, these aren't physics papers or anything like that. Although I have heard of feminist glaciology and that sort of thing. You could call that, it's not really a scientific paper, it's more of a sociology paper.
Yeah. So,
But
the problem is pretty, yeah.
So, I can't say this with certainty.
Yeah.
But a huge problem in the physics community right now is how much research and time and effort has been put into, this is just one example, string theory, when it's born zero free.
Right.
And I've heard multiple reports from within the physics community that if you question it or try to or try to shed light on this sort of waste of resources, that you get hounded by other physicists. Some of whom are still actually believe in it. Some of whom have staked their entire careers on it and can't afford to stop, to get their funding on track.
There's some really interesting aspects to this. I don't agree with everything he says, but there's a really interesting book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. His theories of knowledge and what he says about incommensurability and all that stuff is problematic, but essentially what he says is that people are indoctrinated into a paradigm, and they're taught the basics, and then those basics are sort of black boxed. It's here's all the stuff that's true about physics, now go and build off of that. And it's stuff maybe string theory is one of those, where it's just well, here's some stuff that's true, now go out and build on that. Whereas we don't even have a shred of evidence that string theory is true, and we don't even have a possible way to figure out whether or not there is evidence for string theory. So string theory is so theoretical that we can't even think of practical experiments to run to be able to verify it. Even if we can't do those right now, we can't even think of possible experiments to run. But yet, if you say something against that, that might be, that might get your funding stripped. There's a lot of stuff like that. especially if you ever watched the movie Expelled. It's an older movie now, but it's with Ben Stein. It's like a documentary with Ben Stein in it, where he's going around interviewing a bunch of scientists who were essentially either fired or had their papers redacted or retracted or refused were refused funding because they did intelligent design work. And it's like, well, you can't do that. You're not a real scientist if you're doing this sort of thing. So, a lot of that stuff happens, and this is just a couple of examples of it. But then you also, on the other side, have stuff that's so out there, like feminist glaciology and feminist astronomy. Well, of course, that one was made up, but
Yeah.
I think
How would feminist astronomy differ from regular astronomy?
It's, we gotta empower women through astrology or something.
it's not just that I heard one of the authors of the Grievance Affair, James Lindsay. He said that there was actually a legitimate paper published. It wasn't one of the fake ones they wrote, but it was a legitimate one on feminist glaciology. And they said that in the paper, they asked a glaciologist why they're not taking feminism into consideration in their study of in their study of glaciers. And he essentially just told them to leave. And
I mean,
that was evidence to them that glaciology is fundamentally anti-feminist and male-dominated and all that stuff. And his papers, I think he even mentioned something about glacier sex. That glacier sex is never mentioned in papers on glaciology. Glaciers don't have sex. So it's very bizarre stuff.
Yeah, and these aren't coming from a vacuum. Because these papers are still up because these journals are, I think they're required to by law to still have access to redacted articles. And you can see, they're still citing a bunch of papers on this. So it's not like it's not like from a vacuum. They're still borrowing ideas from actual scientists that have these ideas. And so the social scientists, this affects them more because they're more theoretical, so they can afford to be wrong. If you're an engineer and you do like some sort of DI project, it's gonna fail. So you can't afford to be as wrong as that. But this makes me, so there's this new theory that's actually trying to be brought up, and it's this idea that males, like their IQ distribution, they're more likely to have lower and higher IQs, so they're still, so the average gender IQ is still the same, but the male distribution is more evened out, and then that's being suppressed by the scientific community because it goes against, the idea that men and women are the same. There's no biological differences, and so actual important ideas that could genuinely shape public policy and ideas, they're being repressed because they don't follow a certain agenda. And then, so idolization of the self, and so they call this the global and most prominent cult, the sociologists that I mentioned earlier. And so I think that this is for several reasons, and one of them is because this isn't a standalone thing. So for instance, with politics, you idolize certain individuals in the science, there's idolization of scientists and them being deemed infallible. And so this is kind of like the most prominent idolization because it's with all the other spheres of idolization. And so with society, as we became less religious, we deemed man more good and less evil. So we've lost this idea that we're wounded and we need God. And so because of that, we've deemed man as becoming or being able to become morally perfect. And this contributes to the authoritarianism problem because, if you're an atheist and you're a communist, you'll deem Stalin or Mao or lately I've even seen some Kim Jong-un glazers. They've glazed certain individuals because of their ideology and because of whatever. And so this contributes to the problem because if you deem them as morally perfect, then just give them all power. Why not? And so what this also contributes to is a problem of radical individualism. And this has led to more and more people wanting to be liberated and given choices, which has also affected society because we've given up certain duties. So for instance, J.D. Unwin, he was an anthropologist from the 1930s, and so he analyzed 80 ancient societies. And so what he found was that as societies loosen on their sexual ethics to become more promiscuous and more open to polygamy, they have 3 generations to get back on track once they'll fail. And so what this shows is that with the sexual evolution, according to his work, this leads to several problems. One of them is just being a lower birth rate. There's several factors to that, but as birth rates decrease, the working class starts to, or the working age starts to decrease the population, and so they have to not only take care of the younger generation, but they don't take care of an ever-growing aging population, which societies can't really maintain. And then, so I kind of talked about that here, where, a low birth rate, which secularism causes, this has several problems, and one of them is being how, it relates to other countries. So South Korea right now, they have a birth rate of 0.7. And so what that means is that every generation is a third the size of the previous generation. So if there's 100 people in one generation, there's going to be 30 people in the next generation. And so what this could tell is that so North Korea, for example, their birth rate is 1.6. So basically all they really have to do is just wait it out, and then at some point, South Korea can't really fight back. And so this creates a lot of global problems that could occur, more war, for example, because there's more incentive to take over countries because it's not going to really be much of a pushback. And then it also creates a meaning crisis. So people aren't given a clear way to find meaning. And so theoretically, you could argue that this might cause people to give more meaning, like what Nietzsche, some existentialist thought. But what we observe is that's not the case because, man has a certain goal, and if he's not given that goal, it causes all sorts of problems. And then so we found out that secularism doesn't work, but there's other religions. And so what if Islam is an answer? And then, so the first thing with Islam is that it doesn't solve the problem of science, like what Michael was talking about. Toby Huff, in his book, The Rise of Early Modern Science, Islamic societies only developed science as far as it would help them. So they made certain geometry inventions to help them like find which way to pray to the Kaaba, which is like the black stone. And so what after that, after they've said that, you know, we've already found everything that we need, they begin to repress science and different philosophy, like Greek philosophy. And I think it was Ibn Rashid who studied Aristotle, and they found out that he was studying foreign philosophy, and so they came up to him and they said, "We're going to put you on trial for studying Aristotle." And so he had to lie to the Islamic authorities at that time in order to not be killed. And a lot of different scientists also had the same thing happen to them. They had to repress their ideas because they were seen as foreign and innovations and not compatible with Islamic theology. And then it also creates moral problems. So Davis Brown, he has done a lot of work on this, and so he has studied several different societies, Islamic, Christian, and Buddhist, and what he found was that Islam creates more interstate armed conflict because of like their doctrines of, you know, get rid of the you know, jihad. Islam has a doctrine of minor jihad, which is fighting in the name of Allah, like physical fighting, not spiritual, and to fight the unbelievers. And this creates conflict not only with other religions but with Islamic sects. So they believe that the Sunnis believe that the Shias are unbelievers, and the Shias believe that the Sunnis are unbelievers. And they face the same fate, essentially. So they'll just fight each other over whatever doctrines that they disagree with. And
none of them like the Sufis.
yeah. And
I do want to say, just for a little bit of nuance, I think the majority of Muslims don't actually really care. Like, they look askance at, like, the Sunnis who are like, okay, you Shia are weird, like, why do you make all that stuff up? And same thing with the Sufis, they'll be like, I don't even really know if they're Muslim. But it's really only the radical elements that
this has
hate each other and kill each other.
Yeah, well, yeah. Historically, it was very different, but I think Islamic societies actually have had to assimilate into Western values.
They're
because-
secularizing right now,
Yeah. Like right now with Iran, actually, they're starting to, the regime is falling because for several reasons. And another problem with Islam is that it allows for cousin and child marriage. And so the problems with these, I mean, obviously they have moral problems, but even societally speaking, child marriage increases infant mortality rate and maternal mortality rate. And if that happens, you know, without mothers involved or without infants, that creates problems not only with the infants growing up without mothers, but you know, you don't have a sustaining population if you can't get your infants to grow up. And with cousin marriage specifically, is that this causes several genetic problems, and this is one of the most significant reasons why a lot of Islamic cultures have like an IQ of 70, because they have generations upon generations of cousin marriage. And this leads to a decrease in not only just trying to think of scientific stuff, but trying to even like get basic advancements in your societies. And so even though that they have like a lot of resources with like Saudi Arabia, they can't really utilize them the same way that Western countries do, because they've been subjugated to generations of cousin marriage. And that's what, there's not an authoritarianism problem. So Stephen Fish, in his book, Are Muslims Destructive, found that Islam is highly correlated and there's a causal link with Islam and authoritarianism, which, for the same reasons as I mentioned, those have problems like with just human rights violations and things like that. And then, so Christianity is probably the only solution that can account for this. So Christianity allows for science to keep its original purpose, which is to gain knowledge about the world, specifically the natural world, and to uncover God's design for us. And this keeps science from becoming dogmatic and allows it to become more efficient. And then so with ethics, so going back to J.D. Unwin in his work on how strict sexual ethics is necessary for society to not collapse. With Christianity, you know, it promotes monogamy and it goes against promiscuity. And so